Hi. All right, so I think some of how I end up thinking about this stuff can seem a little obtuse. So let me tell you how I think about it. I think all of us have an identity and a core self that ultimately is derived from God and what He says about us and what our gifts and purposes are in the world. When you look at the maturation of an entrepreneur or any person with any specialty, I think in the end we end up, most of us experience some level of success before we experience real clarity about our identity. We have some hunch about something that we really love or we're good at, and we push into that. And it turns out, we know how to do something in business, or we know how to do something really well in marriage or family, or we find something in the world, some mission, some ministry, some purpose that we find so compelling that we really care about that, and we find that we groove with it, and we find some level of success. But that tends to happen more readily than the deeper work of understanding who we are and what our purposes are in the world and how we're best utilized. When I think about this maturation process, I think of these 6 stages. So there's prep, and that's all the school and how you get started, and then how you get ready to decide you're going to go leap into something. Then there's launch, and that's where first dollars, first team, and you're trying something out. It's where failing fast happens a lot. After that, there's hustle. And so now you've got a sense of, well, here's how we're going to build this thing. We have a good sense about what will work. You get some more funding. This is where serial entrepreneurs rinse and repeat very often. These 3 stages tend to be about proving something to the past. One of the things that I think keeps people in that hustle stage is you've got a lot of, call them ethical challenges. What are you really willing to invest and give and pay for this work you're doing? It's where most of the divorces happen. It's where you are so pot committed that you really kind of can't go forward. You have to keep proving something. There's a lot of real value in that, and you don't get to the right-hand side until you've gone through the left-hand side. But in between, there's this identity gap. And this is where the invitation to figure out who you are really opens up. And after that answer starts to come clear, and for most of us, the answers start to show up before we really have thought about, that's what we're asking about, is this who am I and what am I about? But on the far side of it, instead of proving something to the past, instead of saying, what am I going to do? Or in this middle saying, so what? Giving to the future is about now what? So what will I build? For whom? For what purposes? And you can start answering more profound questions than is appropriate or practical to answer when you're just trying to pedal the bike fast enough to keep going. So the 3 phases that I see on the forward-facing side are cruise, meaning you've reached cruising altitude. You've reached a certain level of success, not that your feet are up on the counter or on the desk, but that you know this is how this thing works. An example that I think of often is a gentleman who has a successful orthodonture practice. So he went through all the schooling, went through all of the learning about how to create a practice, went through all of the narrow places getting that practice up and going, and then it became clear this is about the mature size of this practice. And around that same time, he discovered medical missions. And so what his world looks like now is he was able to mature more rapidly than his organization. So you'll see on this diagram there's this flow state. Flow is usually where you've got a balance between skill and challenge. And if the challenge is greater than your skill, you'll experience a sense of being overwhelmed. If your skill is greater than the challenge in front of you, it feels a little bit like boredom or cynicism, but really it's about capacity. It's how you can have an orthodonture practice and discover medical missions. So what he did is he started moving into medical missions, but the whole practice was still absolutely counting on him for all of the decisions. And so his inattention created certain levels of rattle in his practice. Well, he knew that wasn't where he wanted to spend all of his time. He wasn't going to give up the medical missions and the things that were an expression of his capacity. So he had a choice to make, and very often what people do is they will sell at this point. And there's a big difference between selling or exiting and just getting out. Usually, if you sell because you aren't really invested in it anymore, that's getting out. And that's not the same thing as a well-earned exit. You should exit to something greater by capitalizing on everything that's there in that orthodontia practice. So a step that's often overlooked is this idea of lift. So how are you going to come back and prepare that practice or that entity so that it can survive really well without everything having to ride on your shoulders? Who's the operations manager you should hire, that sort of thing. At that phase, you also get to start answering questions of meaning and substance. And those questions are usually inappropriate to ask or answer when it's two people in a garage in a startup who just have to pedal the bike fast. But they're critical to answer when you get to a certain size where the rewards have multiple faces. And so what you're creating there needs to be broader, deeper, and more substantial. And then the last step is about exiting. So what do you do? What do you hook onto that leads you into a life beyond that professional success? I'm drawn very much to people who are in that identity gap or to the right. And that might be in business, it might mean in family, and it might mean in mission or purpose, like the medical missions thing. And so the products that I produce are brand strategy and messaging around culture. There are private memoirs for families and what it means to be part of a family in terms of a legacy. What is your first name experience in the context of your last name reality? And then the last has to do with what are your mission values, or what are the purposes you stand for. One of the products is called a CEO platform, and in this example, it would be what does that orthodonture practice, what does that owner care about that creates a natural halo effect for his brand practice? In what ways might medical missions and him focusing there and having stories to share invite people into caring about his orthodonture brand more? There's a link here on this website to Max Yoder's Do Better Work. Max is the CEO at Lessonly, which has now been acquired by Seismic. But Lessonly was a learning management system. It's a software for teaching courses. But the book we worked on is about nonviolent communication, which was critical to the way Max is wired. It came because he had a certain level of capacity to focus on that and build culture. And it revolutionized what it meant to be at Lessonly. It revolutionized what the brand stood for. I mean, how do you differentiate, other than very technical ways, one LMS from another? Well, this culture was radically different because Max created a halo effect, and then the folks in his marketing department did a phenomenal job of harnessing that. The CEO can speak to things that marketing can't speak to directly because the CEO is talking about personal passion, and then that halo is something that marketing can amplify, but if marketing does it directly, it just doesn't ring true. Same thing happens if what you've experienced in terms of success comes not from your business first, but from your family. Well, what are you going to do on a professional or income level to protect the lifestyle of your family? What, as a family, will you point to or serve or align with? And then what does it mean ultimately to be part of that family? How do you capture that? And how do you align it with something meaningful for the family members to pick up and run with? And if your success starts off in a purpose or a mission and doesn't solve an economic need, then there's a vulnerability there, and the answer to that vulnerability has everything to do with the identity that made the mission work. The other thing I've seen plenty of times is ministry or purpose-driven nonprofit leaders who over-sacrifice, who blow up their marriages, who burn themselves out, who end up really strong in one or two things related to their mission, but everybody else around them pays a great deal. It might be their family because they're absent. It might be donors who see them moving from one idea to the next, but never really finishing anything because on a business and non-magical thinking kind of layer, they just aren't solving from their identity. In the end, I'm convinced that our identities solve the recipes for our lives, but it sounds flaky at first. It sounds indulgent at first, and it sounds like, the answers ultimately are rooted in who God says we are, and so we start off having to listen rather than asserting who we are. And it takes somebody to listen with us. I absolutely am a recipient of this as much as I am a vendor and purveyor of this service. We have to find out, usually in the company of somebody else, who am I really? What do I know for sure? And then how do I package that? And how do I create an integrity of self? What's the right pace and cadence for this? For me, I tend to go way too quickly, and am presently learning that God's pace for me is about 2.5 miles an hour. It's the pace of walking, and it's one step and then the next. My joy and the thing I've gotten pretty good at is being able to hear who you are, what your core passion is, find the places where you have success, align that with identity, and then pull out identity in any of these three buckets, these business, family, and purpose or platform. And that's where it goes. It's a complicated, it's an unusual and deeper than usual process, but it's beautiful, and it's all about you, and it's all about listening, and then it's about holding up and responding to beauty. That's what this whole journey is where does the light of heaven fall in your world in ways that you find captivating? And that's all it is hunting for those reflections and then bottling that up so that other people see what you're in love with. That's what I'm here for.